This is Toon Shaders Pro, and in this video I want to show off some of the main features of this asset pack. As with my other asset packs, in the root folder you'll see the README, and this will include a breakdown of all of the assets in the pack and what kind of features you can expect from things in the pack. This also has my email contact details, so if you encounter any bugs, or if you have any feature requests, or if you just want to show off what games you've made with the pack, please do reach out to me there. I'm always checking my emails to see if I've got requests from users. But yeah, without further ado, let's get on with the pack. If you downloaded this from if you purchased this from the Unity Asset Store, you can download it through Window Package Manager, and it will be in the My Assets section. If you downloaded this from itch or any other storefront, then you'll have to right-click in the project view and go to Import Package, Custom Package, and then find the Unity package file that you downloaded, and it will install the pack for you. Toon Shaders Pro comes with this sandworm demo. This legally distinct sandworm that isn't from anything, I promise. No points for what movies and books I've been watching and reading lately. But yep, this has the main Toon shader applied to it. So let's go through each of the properties on that material. There are quite a lot. It supports the main surface options that you see with something like Unity's built-in lit renderer. Stuff like the surface type is opaque or transparent, which face to render. So if you select back faces here, then it looks absolutely horrifying. And alpha clipping, stuff like receive shadows, which is quite good. And here's the first custom property, is the shadow threshold. So internally, Unity will use values between 0 and 1 for whether something is unlit at 0 or fully lit at 1, and then there's normally a fall off between, but we can apply thresholds to this. So if I want a hard border between lit and unlit areas, then I can use thresholds that are quite close together. Essentially, values or input shadow values below shadow ends will get clamped to 0 or full shadow, and things above the lit starts will get clamped to 1 or lit, and then anything between these has a smooth fall off. So if I were to make these an identical value, we get a very hard cutoff. But if this is a bit higher, then it's slightly smoother. Next, we have the diffuse settings, and you have the choice of using 1 threshold or 2. So I'm currently using 2, and here's the cutoff for the first threshold, here's the cutoff for the second one. It's essentially I can use a fully lit, a fully dark, and an optional midtone. We can apply base color and base texture, which is exactly what you would expect from any lit material. And then we have the tints applied to the light, the lit, the midtones, and the shadow. So I can turn those all the way down, or I could make that red, and that makes it a bit more obvious where they are. And for the midtones, I could make that blue, and it's multiplying blue by brown, and we're getting this very dark color. But that should illustrate where the midtones and the dark areas were in this object. But we can modify these thresholds. So if I want my midtones to extend further across the object, then again, these have fall off. So if the difference between this and this is quite high, then it's less toony and a bit more smoothed out. But I can have a very, very small boundary. In fact, if they're identical, we get a hard boundary between the lit and the midtones. Or we can reduce it slightly here and get a little bit of a fall off, which I think looks quite nice. And similarly for the first threshold, so I can increase that and it will travel further up the object. Then I have specular lighting, which is to do with the angle between the viewer and the surface normal. And the specular is in the middle here. You can see it moving as I move around the object. If I increase the strength, that makes it a bit more obvious where it is. And this uses similar thresholds. So I could increase these, and the specular affected areas get smaller, or I can have a wide difference, and then there's a lot of fall off. The difference here is that, well, first of all, we also have a glossiness property, and glossiness, if this is higher, we get smaller highlights. It's like in real life actually. If you were to polish a ball really, really smoothly, you would see tiny highlights, but they're very bright. And then if you have a bit more of a diffuse sphere, then you'll see the highlights look bigger on it, but with like more fall off. And the other thing we have is this noise offset. And I think it's actually easier to show on the Suzanne mesh here, the famous Blender monkey. I have to make sure I get the right material because I have a couple of these. It is this one. If I were to increase the strength of this offset noise here, then the specular gets broken up, and it gives it more of a sort of like sketched look. It's like the specular has sort of like been painted on, rather than just reflecting in. Of course, if this is like all the way down, then it's a blob. Let's go back to my legally distinct one. Next we have the rim lighting. And the rim lighting is typically around the outer shell of an object, if it's a sphere. And this is to do with the angle between the light, I think it's the reflected vector from the lighting and the view vector. So it will appear around the object. It's also good for Fresnel, and this is similar. We have thresholds and we can change them. But this is when it's quite high, it covers a lot of the surface of the object. If you want a quick and easy way of extending the rim around an object, then I have a rim extension property, which kind of does that for you. And that lets you just add a little bit more rim, just because sometimes there isn't much. But if you increase this too much, it will start to encroach on like the bottom of the object where I don't want any rim lighting, so don't have this too high. Finally, I have the normal mapping, and that acts exactly the same as you would expect from any lit material. The worm here looks very, very smooth if I have rim lighting off, but not rim lighting, normal mapping off. But if we include one, it's a lot more textured and looks a lot nicer. You might have also noticed that the terrain also uses the Toon shader, and that has the same sort of properties. The only additional one here, or the main additional one here, is stochastic texturing, which is basically a set of UV tricks, stuff like offsetting and rotating and scaling and stuff, that breaks up tiling. So if I turn it off, the tiling on the terrain, certainly the mountains here, is very obvious. But this is a super quick way of just breaking up that tiling without having to do anything with the textures yourself. You will still see repeated parts of textures, it's just a lot less obvious. And you can kind of do stuff like attach separate specular maps. So that's almost everything to do with the base tune effect. The only thing remaining is we also have a graph version. And this is intended for people to make modifications to make their own effects that use the Toon aesthetic. The difference here with some of my other asset packs is that all of the magic happens in this subgraph called Calculate Toon Lighting, which itself uses an HLSL custom function. So it's a little bit less powerful, just because if I implemented every single feature of this effect in its own full graph, then it would be an absolute nightmare to navigate. It would be a huge graph. So I've supplied subgraphs for this, and you can actually there are other subgraphs that will sort of do things you might want, like mix the fog at the end or do stuff with the normal map. And I'd encourage exploring these. They can be quite helpful even outside of projects where you want Toon lighting. The other main thing in Toon Shaders Pro is the outline effect. And this has a lot of properties, so I'll try and blast through these as quick as I can. First off, we have the render pass event, and this will determine whether the outlines get rendered before or after URP's internal post-processing. So the stuff that you see on like the global volume when you create a new scene, stuff like tone mapping, bloom, and vignette. The main thing here is probably something like bloom or color correction, which modify the colors of the scene. If you apply the outlines first, then stuff like bloom and color mapping, tone mapping, color adjustments get applied to the outlines. So here I'm using pure black, but some of the outlines appear a bit smoother. If I do this after, then it is just going to render in pure black, because it's happening after stuff like bloom. So that is quite important. That will have quite a drastic effect on the appearance of the outlines. And next we have the outline type, and I have a lot of presets here. The first of which is just no outlines, very simple. Next is the depth normal outlines, and I personally think this is the weakest of the outlines in the pack, but I wanted to include them anyway. What this does is it takes image gradients, so each pixel of the image, it will compare the color, the depth, and the normals of the adjacent pixels, and depending on some sensitivity values, if the difference is big enough along those three metrics, it will render as an outline pixel. So if I were to turn down the color strength here, you'll see which pixels were rendering outlines because like the difference in their pixel colors were quite high. So it's a lot of the highlights on the sand here. And similarly with the depth, you'll see it on the sand dunes and the normals. You'll mainly see in the mountains here. But you can play around with these values and kind of get an aesthetic that you like. Next up is actually my favorite in the pack, is the high quality object mask outlines. And these are quite complicated. What this is doing under the hood is it's re-rendering each object in the scene to a mask texture, and then performing these similar kinds of color difference, gradient differences on the mask. And there's a debug option here, so I can look at the mask that's drawn, and it only draws it in the red color channel, so everything's kind of reddish here. But you can see every object, or at least like every part of every object, is rendered with a unique color or ID, and then the outlines are drawn around that. Currently, the mask values are seeded by the world position of the object. So if you want objects to have distinct outlines around them compared to another object, you will need to make sure they have different world positions. That's kind of a limitation of the way I could get the mask to render. It was very difficult to find a way to get unique values for every single mesh, and I am exploring other options for this, but hopefully in the future it will be automatic and be able to get a unique ID for every object without having to rely on world positions. But for now, just keep that in mind. It's quite important. So for the options, first of all, we have the color, and that was also present on the depth normal outlines. I just forgot to show that. So yeah, this is very straightforward. For the object mask based outlines, and there's more than one kind of object mask outline, we can control which layers to render outlines for. So let's put the one in a layer called render outlines. On my effect, I'm rendering both default and render outlines. But if I only render the render outlines layer, then I'm only rendering outlines around this layer. And this is the reason I use object masks, is because it makes stuff like this possible. I'm very happy to have this in the pack. This is the bit that took the longest to figure out. Thanks, Unity. I love getting random loading bars. But yeah, this is super cool. You can have nothing, you can have everything, and I think I'm going to keep that as just default and render outlines. Ooh. We can ignore depth. So if you click this, it is going to disregard depth when it renders the outlines into the mask. And this is great for if you want an X-ray effect, but otherwise it's going to make stuff look weird. It's going to render through walls and floors. You might not want that, but yeah, it's that. The drawing mode is either per object, which is what you see here, or per triangle. And this is going to have an obvious effect here, is every single triangle is what it says on the tin, really. You'll notice that it stops at a certain point, but we'll see that later. Or you can merge everything into one mask and render the outlines just around everything. And this is quite interesting because, in fact, if I render the debug mask, then everything is now given the same debug mask value. But you usually won't want that, so I'll keep it per object. Next, we have the light modes, which is maybe a bit hard to understand if you don't write HLS or base shaders yourself. But essentially, when you write HLS or shaders, you write a series of passes, and each kind of object will probably have different passes. So the basic bits you'll have to remember here is that most lit shaders, including lit shader graphs, will use a tag called universal forward. The Toon Shaders in my pack use a slightly different tag called universal forward only, and most unlit shaders, including unlit shader graphs, use a tag called SLP default unlit. And by adding different types of light mode here to this list, we can filter out which material types are rendered into the mask. So if I only wanted, I didn't want my Toon materials, but I did want, very quickly, a default Unity sphere. Where's I put that? So because the sphere uses a light mode tag called universal forward, because it's a lit shader, it's rendered, but my Toon shaders aren't because they use universal forward only. And this is quite good if you want to restrict certain kinds of material. If you want to catch all, most materials will use something like depth only, and that will include everything, or most things. But I'm happy with this combination. This covers basically everything. The render queue is kind of here as a future-proofing mechanism. Because of the way that opaques and transparents work, it's easiest to render opaques to the mask, the intermediate mask texture. When I render transparents as well, or if I only render transparents, I actually have a backup mesh here that uses a transparent shader, and it can be kind of weird the way it renders. It's not exactly rendering properly. And this is something that I will explore for future versions, because I would love to be able to render outlines on transparent objects, but at the moment it's not very easy to do so. So I would recommend keeping this either as all, which renders both opaque and transparent, or just leave it as opaque. That's probably good enough. Next we have the outlines. Thickness, so very straightforward. Turn it down and up. The efficiency of drawing the outlines does decrease as the thickness gets larger. So I've implemented a ceiling on this. It can be up to 5. I am exploring different outline rendering algorithms for future versions that might make this more efficient, but at the minute, I thought this was a good trade-off because the outlines can be still quite thick. And I also have smoothing property. So when this is 0, the outlines are jagged. But if I increase this slightly, it is a kind of pseudo anti-aliasing. It smooths out the outline somewhat. I can choose to render my outlines either outside a masked object, or inside it, or on both sides of it. So both sides is going to let us have even thicker outlines. But let's turn that down to something like that. I think it looks quite good. And then I also have these fade values. So if I want to only render the outlines at certain distances, then I can turn this end value down. And if I want to start fading out outlines, then I can turn down the fade start. Basically, anything between the fade start and the fade end distance from the camera in meters, it will have a fall off between fully outlined and transparent. So if that's 50, then these mountains here are just about 50 meters away and they stop being rendered, but I prefer to keep this at slightly higher values, so actually everything is outlined. Finally, we can enable depth normals, which adds on the depth normal texturing or outlining that we have in the depth the depth normal outline type, which can be quite nice. It's just an additional little bit of extra outlines if you need them. Next, we have the pixel width object mask outlines, and these are very similar to the high quality ones, but far more efficient because it always renders a single pixel width outline. And these are quite nice, but of course you can't modify the thickness. And most of the properties of the object mask are the same. Finally, we have the hull outlines. So you may have heard of the inverted hull method for drawing outlines, where we render materials a second time, but this time, say if we rendered front faces, instead we render back faces, and we expand the mesh along the object normals. And it's a quick and dirty effect. It's a lot more efficient than the other kinds of outlines, but it can result in slightly broken discontinuities where your mesh has kind of sharp edges. But for a quick and dirty outline effect, it can be good enough, especially for spherical objects. So I think this actually looks a lot better on the Suzanne mesh than it does on the worm. And these options here are pretty straightforward. We have the thickness. As long as you don't have this as a ridiculous value, then these can look quite nice. This thickness is unity units along the normals. So 0.01 is in fact 0.01 meters. So if we zoom out, this is in world space, which can be desirable. The other kinds of outlines are happening in screen space, so they have different kind of strengths and weaknesses. Then I also have transparency. So if I have this on and I turn the transparency down or the alpha of the outline color down, then it will actually be transparent. But if it's off, then they will always be opaque. So let's turn that back up. Then we have lighting. So this is an interesting one. Maybe a bit of a niche use, but if I turn this white, the outline color is dependent on the main directional light. So obviously if this is black, then it's multiplicative, so multiplying any lighting value by black will result in black. But here, because it's white, then some parts of this outline are appearing lit and some are unlit, or shadowed. And yeah, I think this is kind of a niche use, but we can flip the direction if you want. Maybe easier to see on the sphere actually. Yeah, and so you can have a minimum value, so like a floor for the amount of lighting applied. So if this is 0, then these parts here are fully unlit, and these parts are fully lit. If we make that red, then yeah, you can probably get some nice effects with this. But again, I think this is a slightly niche application of the hull outlines. We can turn it off and turn it back to black. And that is it for the major features of Toon Shaders Pro. I hope this was helpful to watch. If you have any feature requests or bug reports, or if you've made any games with the pack, I would very much love to see them. Reach out to the email in the README. And if you do like the pack, a review would be very much appreciated. It really helps me get the pack into more people's hands. Having reviews. But yeah, that's it for this video. Hope this was helpful, and good luck using the pack. Thanks for watching.